Rebel Moon has long been marketed as Zack Snyder's version of Star Wars. He had a story he wanted to tell, and when things didn't work out with Disney and Lucasfilm, he went on to adjust the story a little bit to fit within its own little universe. But comparing any new film to Star Wars is a high standard to live up to, no matter who the director is behind the camera. So did Rebel Moon live up to the hype? Well, if you've seen any of the reviews since the film premiered on Netflix last week, then you know that the general consensus is no. Part 1 of Rebel Moon, Child of Fire, has been met with an overall negative reaction from critics and audiences alike. However, for me personally, I don't think it was nearly as bad as some people have made it out to be. But I really do wish that I had avoided reviews for the film before going in to see it for myself, because naturally I had a bit of a bias based on what most people had said about it when I saw it for the first time. There were times when I leaned a little more pessimistic in my reception because of the influence some reviews had on me. This is something that I just like to add before going in depth into my review so that you may understand where I'm coming from, because when I actually finished the movie, I found myself a bit lost in what I was feeling. There's actually a lot of good about this film, but with almost everything, it feels like a double-edged sword. The most apparent of these being the cinematography. Snyder is known for making beautiful films, and Rebel Moon is no different. The cinematography is amazing, and every scene is something to marvel at. You could take almost any still moment from the movie and it would look like an incredible poster. The visual effects and lighting are superb, and I have to applaud Snyder and the team for that. But when it comes to Rebel Moon, I never thought that a film could be too cinematic. I would have loved to have been able to sit back, take in and admire everything that this new universe had to offer, because it really was beautiful. But it often felt like the cinematography was more important than the story or developing any relevant themes interwoven into the story. It was constantly overtaking the story and the characters, making the visuals stand out to the audience more than anything. The new planets were incredibly unique, but there was so much CGI used, mainly with the sky and the atmosphere, that it never really felt like a lived-in place. Seeing a massive planet on the horizon out in space is cool a few times, but then we get to the planets that are literally so tainted orange or blue that it looks more like science fiction, set 1,000 years in the future, than any fantastical story. I also don't know what it is with Snyder and Sons, but I swear there was a sun in the background of nearly every shot, meant to make the lighting look stunning and cinematic. But you can only do the same thing so many times before the audience catches on and becomes too aware. Eventually it loses any impact or resonance that it had because it was overused. Another double-edged aspect of the movie would be its action sequences. I loved what we got from the third act. I thought the larger action sequences there were very fun and captivating to watch. And the main reason for this was that Snyder let it be fast, let it be expansive. It's a big fight, but he takes the time to focus in on a few different characters during it. It was allowed to be fast-paced and chaotic, make it feel like an actual battle sequence or war, but for some reason, everything else had to be in slow motion. It felt like almost every other action sequence was in slow motion, making this movie feel like it went on forever. Where a movie typically increases its pacing during action, providing an up and down roller coaster to keep audiences engaged, Snyder chose to slow the action down and make the entire thing a flat roller coaster. And let's just say that there's a reason you've never been on one of those. You don't get any highs with the film and you don't get any lows. It plays everything remarkably safe. No significant risks. Just a steady story that gets you from point A to point B. Even some normal scenes were included in slow motion to increase their cinematography, but again it disrupted the pacing of the movie. Rather than flowing naturally, it feels like the film was slowing down to say, "Hey you, look at this. Pretty cool, right? Let's watch it a little longer." I've never really minded slow motion in Snyder's films before, but here it felt as excessive as can be. But again, if you can move beyond that, the choreography is done very well, where I think every action sequence would be exciting to watch at normal speed. All of the characters are incredible fighters, and there's a good mix of weaponry to keep it all unique. We've got blasters, swords, a cane, which only makes the decision to slow it all down and make us watch every single detail of the fights so much more disappointing. Going more into the story, characters, and world building, I really feel like this film suffers from being a part 1 of 2. It's constantly rushing to make part 1 feel like its own thing, its own cohesive movie, but then it remembers that it can't tell the entire story here, so it leaves some details out for later. In my opinion, telling movies like this is almost always a bad idea, because when you go in as a filmmaker already knowing that this is only a part 1, that you're not telling the entire story here, it leads to an incomplete film. Because Rebel Moon was so tightly connected to Star Wars when it was first announced, it's hard not to use that as an example. George Lucas had his 3-part story with the original trilogy, but he didn't know how the first one would do if he'd be allowed to continue. So as a result, A New Hope works perfectly as a singular film. The end ties the story up nicely, no loose plot points or teases at the future. It seamlessly gets continued in The Empire Strikes Back, but you don't need to watch the sequel to feel like you get the whole story. With Rebel Moon, I don't see how you could watch Part 1 or Part 2 and not the other. It doesn't feel like it can stand on its own 2 feet, the likely reason why they're releasing Part 2 only a few months later. It's not like they need to go work on Part 2 now, it's already done, but they knew that the audiences were not going to feel content after this one movie. Rebel Moon introduces an expansive new universe, and one that I don't think I understand a thing about after spending over 2 hours in it. There are so many different characters introduced that it feels like we don't get to spend enough time getting to know this place. Every planet they visit, which had to have been close to 5 or 6, is only there for aesthetic and for a new character to join the fight. They don't feel lived in or get the time to feel like an actual place that I could visit. There's also the entire thing with the government and the dead king, and it's really underdeveloped in the film. I'm sure it's something we could learn more about in Part 2, but other than some sparse details, I don't feel like I really understand the nature of the universe that we're in, other than lots of wars and assassination of the royal family. We're spending so much time on the outer reaches of the galaxy that we don't get to see what's really going on with the Mother World. Although the reveal of Daddy Regent Balisarius at the end gives me hope for the sequel. It actually took me a bit to confirm that Korra's adopted father was the new regent ruling the Mother World, but I do think that this will hopefully be an interesting dynamic to develop in Part 2. The mystery surrounding the royal family's assassination feels very purposeful, like it's going to be revealed later on, and I did enjoy the myth and vagueness that came with it all. Who the assassin is it someone we know? A lot of focus was also put on the princess, making it feel like maybe she's still alive somewhere out there, but I wasn't a fan of how much was revealed to us through monologues and exposition dumps. There were so many flashbacks and character monologues that were solely included to reveal the history, where it dragged on and felt like exposition overload for me. It ran into the problem of telling and not showing, something I noticed extremely present during the first act. As a person in the audience, it felt like the characters were talking to us, making sure we knew what was going on, rather than talking to each other. Although some exceptions can be made when it's Anthony Hopkins as a robot telling the story. That one moment between him and Sam was beautiful, and I do hope we see more of him in Part 2. He ran off after shooting that soldier, and I had completely forgotten about him until he showed up at the end with the reindeer antlers on. For the other characters in the film, their introductions all felt very rushed. Each of them felt important to the story, but so little time was taken to really develop them at all individually, where I don't feel myself having any emotional attachment to any of them. Maybe other than Korra because she's the lead and we got to spend the most time with her. There really was a lack of emotion in the film. No attempt at empathy or fellowship, only oohs and ahs from the audience. I actually did find myself caring about the siblings and their revolution, but even then we only got 1 or 2 solid scenes with them before he was killed off. There were parts of this movie that I really wanted to love, and some parts that I did thoroughly enjoy, but for the most part it was a tedious and uneventful roller coaster all the way through. But I did at least make it to the end. Snyder is such a talented filmmaker, and I really do hope this universe works out for him, because I would love to have another variation of Star Wars. But right now, all I can think of this is as a beautiful, cinematic poor man's Star Wars. Hopefully by the time the second part comes around, the comparisons will stop, because Rebel Moon deserves to be its own thing, but for the time being, it's hard to separate the two. What did you think of Part 1 of Rebel Moon? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to like the video, and subscribe for more movie reviews, and remember to follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Thank you all for watching, and remember, the Force will be with you. Always.